The humiliation at the hotel. It was a crisp morning when Mariah Richardson, an African-American billionaire entrepreneur, entered the luxurious Hotel Royal Grande. The grandiose marble columns and sleek glass chandeliers reflected her polished aura, a woman who had conquered the corporate world through sheer will and determination. As she walked across the marble floors, the sounds of her stiletto heels echoed in the expansive lobby, a steady reminder that she had arrived. The hotel, with its five-star reputation and celebrity clientele, was an epitome of wealth and refinement. Mariah had heard of the hotel's exclusivity and opulence. Its lavish events, celebrity sightings, and high-profile guests had made it a symbol of the upper echelon. But today, as she stood at the entrance, the luxurious gilded doors felt like an impenetrable fortress, one that Mariah had unknowingly underestimated. She approached the front desk with poise and confidence, ready to check in after a long flight. Her success was well known. She had built her fortune from the ground up, creating a multi-billion-dollar empire that spanned across several industries, from tech to real estate. She was a woman of power and influence, celebrated for her intellect, ambition, and trailblazing spirit. But it was that very power, that very confidence, that would make her a target of something darker. As Mariah approached the counter, the hotel staff exchanged glances, each eye flicking toward her before quickly darting away. The receptionist, a young woman barely in her 20s, greeted her with a smile that was less welcoming than it seemed. Mariah's sharp eyes caught the hesitation in the girl's voice as she politely asked for her name. "I'm here to check in." "Mariah Richardson," she responded, her voice calm but laced with the weight of her authority. The receptionist, a woman whose demeanor had suddenly turned stiff, glanced at the computer screen and then back at Mariah, her expression faltering for just a moment. The tension was palpable. Mariah's eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry," the receptionist said, her smile slipping. "I'm afraid I don't see your reservation here." "Are you sure you've made one?" Mariah could feel the shift in the air, the subtle but clear message, "You don't belong here." "I made the reservation under my name." "It should be listed as a VIP booking," she replied coolly, still holding her composure. The receptionist fumbled with the keyboard, typing in Mariah's name with a quiet click-clack of the keys, the screen lighting up in response. After a few moments, her fingers hovered uncertainly above the keys, before she finally spoke. "I'm afraid there is no booking under that name," the receptionist said with a forced smile, her tone growing colder with each passing second. Mariah stood still for a moment, processing what had just transpired. The humiliation was creeping in, but she pushed it aside. Something didn't feel right. "Let me speak with your manager," Mariah said, her voice unwavering. The receptionist seemed startled by the request, but nodded curtly. She made a swift call, asking someone to come to the front desk. Mariah's gaze shifted toward the front of the lobby, her eyes catching sight of the opulent surroundings, the glistening crystal chandeliers, the grand piano in the corner, the finely dressed guests milling about. It all felt like a world that was closed off to her, even as she stood in the heart of it. Moments later, the manager approached, a tall, thin man dressed in a sharp suit, his gait stiff with authority. He exuded an air of condescension before he even spoke. "Ms. Richardson, I understand there's been some confusion with your reservation." "Allow me to look into this," he said with a practiced, neutral smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mariah looked him squarely in the eye, sensing something more beneath the surface of his politeness. She had dealt with prejudice before, subtle, insidious racism that had crept up in ways that were often difficult to put into words. But in this moment, she felt it with brutal clarity. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just a miscommunication. This was something deliberate. The manager took her name into his hands, his fingers lightly caressing the notepad as though it were something precious, as if he were deciding whether or not to let her into the establishment. He glanced at the receptionist, who gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod. "I'm sorry, Ms. Richardson, but it seems our hotel has been fully booked for the next few weeks," the manager said, his voice dripping with insincerity. "We simply cannot accommodate you at this time." Mariah's stomach sank as the words left his mouth. This was more than just a refusal, it was an act of racial rejection, cloaked in a polite, corporate veneer. It was clear that her presence was unwanted here, not because of her reservation, but because of the color of her skin. The room seemed to shrink around her. Her hands clenched into fists by her side, but she stood there, composed. How dare they? The thought echoed in her mind, the sting of racism hitting her like a slap to the face. She could feel her heart rate quicken, but she refused to let the situation control her. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a moment that cut deeper than any rejection she had faced in her life. You're refusing me, because of who I am? Mariah asked, her voice cold as ice, her gaze now fixed on the manager. The manager's smile faltered just slightly. He straightened his shoulders, perhaps sensing the change in her demeanor. His voice grew defensive, though he tried to remain courteous. We don't mean to offend you, Ms. Richardson, he began, his words now sounding hollow. But our hotel has a very specific clientele. We can refer you to other hotels nearby, ones that may be better suited for your needs. Let me speak with your manager, Mariah said, her voice unwavering. The receptionist seemed startled by the request, but nodded curtly. She made a swift call, asking someone to come to the front desk. Mariah's gaze shifted toward the front of the lobby, her eyes catching sight of the opulent surroundings, the glistening crystal chandeliers, the grand piano in the corner, the finely dressed guests milling about. It all felt like a world that was closed off to her, even as she stood in the heart of it. Moments later, the manager approached, a tall, thin man dressed in a sharp suit, his gait stiff with authority. He exuded an air of condescension before he even spoke. Ms. Richardson, I understand there's been some confusion with your reservation. Allow me to look into this, he said with a practiced, neutral smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mariah looked him squarely in the eye, sensing something more beneath the surface of his politeness. She had dealt with prejudice before, subtle, insidious racism that had crept up in ways that were often difficult to put into words. But in this moment, she felt it with brutal clarity. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't just a miscommunication. This was something deliberate. The manager took her name into his hands, his fingers lightly caressing the notepad as though it were something precious, as if he were deciding whether or not to let her into the establishment. He glanced at the receptionist, who gave him a brief, almost imperceptible nod. I'm sorry, Ms. Richardson, but it seems our hotel has been fully booked for the next few weeks, the manager said, his voice dripping with insincerity. We simply cannot accommodate you at this time. Mariah's stomach sank as the words left his mouth. This was more than just a refusal, it was an act of racial rejection, cloaked in a polite, corporate veneer. It was clear that her presence was unwanted here, not because of her reservation, but because of the color of her skin. The room seemed to shrink around her. Her hands clenched into fists by her side, but she stood there, composed. How dare they? The thought echoed in her mind, the sting of racism hitting her like a slap to the face. She could feel her heart rate quicken, but she refused to let the situation control her. This wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a moment that cut deeper than any rejection she had faced in her life. You're refusing me, because of who I am? Mariah asked, her voice cold as ice, her gaze now fixed on the manager. The manager's smile faltered just slightly. He straightened his shoulders, perhaps sensing the change in her demeanor. His voice grew defensive, though he tried to remain courteous. We don't mean to offend you, Ms. Richardson, he began, his words now sounding hollow. But our hotel has a very specific clientele. We can refer you to other hotels nearby, ones that may be better suited for your needs. The rise to power. Mariah Richardson's story wasn't always one of wealth, influence, and respect. It had started far from the polished marble floors of five-star hotels or the opulent boardrooms where corporate titans made decisions. Her path to power had been shaped by hardship, grit, and a relentless drive to prove herself. And it all began in the rough neighborhoods of South Chicago. Born to a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, Mariah learned early that nothing in life would come easy. She spent her childhood in a small, cramped apartment, the faint hum of city traffic the only sound that seemed to accompany her mother's quiet exhaustion after long shifts. But it was in this environment that Mariah's determination was born. She saw the struggle, the exhaustion in her mother's eyes, and knew she would not allow herself to fall into the same cycle. She promised herself that one day, she would never have to worry about where the next meal would come from, or whether she could afford to pay rent. School was her sanctuary. Mariah was an exceptional student, consistently earning top marks. However, she was often underestimated by her peers and even some of her teachers. Being a black girl from a low-income neighborhood meant that doors of opportunity were rarely open to her. She was often judged by the color of her skin before the merit of her abilities. Teachers assumed that she wasn't college material, or that her potential was limited by the circumstances of her upbringing. But Mariah didn't listen. She let their doubts fuel her. She was determined to rise above their expectations, and she did. In high school, she was the top student in her class, excelling in subjects that others considered too complex or too challenging. Her passion for business and economics became apparent early on, as she spent hours poring over textbooks, learning about finance, entrepreneurship, and corporate strategy. The summer before her senior year, she interned at a local startup, working long hours for little pay. But the experience was invaluable. She learned firsthand how businesses were run, how small decisions could snowball into success or failure, and how critical it was to have a strong, visionary leadership team at the helm. It was there, at that startup, that Mariah realized that she could one day be in charge. She could create something of her own, a business that would not only succeed but thrive. With her heart set on building an empire, Mariah applied to several top universities. The rejection letters came quickly. Not enough experience, your background doesn't align with the type of student we're looking for, and we believe you should gain more real-world experience first. It was disheartening, but it was also a turning point. Instead of retreating, she doubled down. Mariah knew she couldn't afford to wait for permission or validation from others. She would pave her own path. She applied to a state school, a solid university with a strong business program. It wasn't prestigious in the traditional sense, but it was her way of proving that a person's worth wasn't determined by the name on their diploma. Mariah worked tirelessly, balancing her studies with part-time jobs. By day, she sat in lecture halls absorbing everything she could about corporate strategy and finance. By night, she worked as a waitress and later as an office assistant, always on the lookout for ways to expand her network and gain new skills. Upon graduating with honors, Mariah entered the business world with a singular vision: to disrupt industries and create innovative solutions that would break barriers. She didn't have the luxury of starting with a hefty bank account, but what she lacked in capital, she made up for with sheer willpower and determination. She started small, launching a tech company that provided digital solutions to small and medium-sized businesses. It was a calculated risk, one that many investors were wary of. She faced skepticism from potential backers, who were often quick to point out that tech was a male-dominated industry, and she was a black woman with no prior track record. But Mariah was undeterred. She knew that if she could deliver results, no one would be able to ignore her. She built her company from the ground up, working long hours, learning from every failure, and always thinking several steps ahead. Her business grew slowly at first, but it did grow. She made smart strategic decisions, cutting unnecessary expenses, reinvesting profits, and building a team of like-minded individuals who shared her vision. She networked relentlessly, forging relationships with key players in tech and venture capital. Slowly, her reputation grew, and more investors began to take notice. The breakthrough came when Mariah landed a contract with a major multinational corporation. They had been searching for a solution to streamline their operations, and Mariah's company had the answer. The deal catapulted her business into the spotlight, attracting attention from larger investors and media outlets. But Mariah didn't let the newfound attention distract her. She kept her focus on growth, scaling her business while maintaining a culture of innovation and inclusion. She was strategic in every move, balancing risk and reward in a way that others found impressive. As her company's revenue grew exponentially, Mariah expanded into new industries. She acquired smaller companies, built a portfolio of real estate investments, and ventured into media and entertainment. Her empire was growing, and Mariah had no plans of stopping. She made smart investments in emerging technologies, positioning herself as a thought leader in the world of artificial intelligence, fintech, and green energy. But despite her success, the challenges continued to mount. The higher she climbed, the more she encountered systemic obstacles, racism, sexism, and discrimination. She had to fight twice as hard to earn the respect of industry leaders, and even then, she was often dismissed or undermined. But every setback, every moment of rejection, only served to fuel her determination further. She was not just building a business, she was building a legacy that would prove her worth in a world that had constantly told her she wasn't enough. The humiliation at the hotel had been the tipping point. It was the moment that crystallized everything for Mariah. The rejection she had experienced was just one example of the bias she faced every day. But it was also the moment when she realized she was no longer willing to settle for anything less than total control. She would take her future into her own hands, and she would make sure that no one would ever have the power to reject her again. Her vision for the future was clear. She wasn't just going to continue to climb the corporate ladder, she was going to redefine the game entirely. She would build companies, invest in people, and create spaces where Black women like herself could thrive, unburdened by the biases that had once held her back. Her goal was not just financial success, it was a revolution in how power was distributed. She would own industries, change the landscape, and inspire a new generation of leaders to follow her lead. And so, as she sat in her sleek office, gazing out over the city skyline, Mariah knew that she was on the cusp of something monumental. The challenges she faced were nothing more than stepping stones on the path to her ultimate goal, taking control of everything that had once been denied to her. The humiliation at the hotel had awakened something deep within her, a fire that would burn until she had rewritten the rules, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked, rejected, or dismissed. This was just the beginning. The artwork's meteoric rise. Approximately 2,000 words. Malik woke up to the sound of a text notification pinging loudly from his phone. He had slept with his face half buried in his pillow, exhausted from another long night of painting in his cramped studio apartment. The city lights had flickered through his thin curtains until late into the night, but he'd pushed on, determined to finish 3 new canvases he hoped to display somewhere, anywhere that might welcome his work. He had yet to find a gallery owner unafraid to feature a bold, young Black artist experimenting with powerful social themes. The humiliating encounter with the prestigious gallery had cast a long shadow over his confidence. But every day, every sunrise, gave Malik a renewed energy to keep going. He believed that if his art was meant to be seen, it would find its path to the light. Rubbing sleep from his eyes, Malik thumbed through his phone to find an unread message from a local art blogger he followed on social media. He'd never actually interacted with her before, other than occasionally liking or sharing her posts. The message was concise: "Hey Malik, discovered your sketches online. Love them. Let's chat." A flurry of curiosity and excitement crashed over him. He sat up straight, adrenaline wiping away the last remnants of drowsiness. For a moment, he stared at the phone, uncertain if he should respond immediately or craft the perfect reply. Eventually, his eagerness won out, and he quickly wrote back, "Thank you. I'm absolutely interested. When can we talk?" Within minutes, the blogger responded, suggesting a quick phone call that very day. Her name was Sasha, and she ran a modest but well-respected blog called City Canvas, which highlighted up-and-coming artists from diverse backgrounds. Although the site wasn't huge, its reputation for finding hidden gems made it quietly influential among certain art aficionados. To Malik, who had spent countless hours emailing galleries, only to be ghosted or politely brushed off, any serious attention felt like a lifeline. He hopped off his bed, rushing through his morning routine, trying to make his tiny kitchen presentable for a potential video call. The space was cluttered with paint tubes, canvases in various stages of completion, and a small pile of business cards he had collected from a local art fair. The walls were plastered with his own sketches, faces of strangers, bursts of color that reflected his moods, abstract shapes that symbolized cultural unity. He cleared a corner of the kitchen table just in time for his phone to ring. When Malik answered, he was greeted by a bright face with curly hair and an immediate, genuine smile. Sasha introduced herself enthusiastically, explaining how she had stumbled upon a couple of his sketches when someone retweeted them on social media. She was curious about his story, his influences, and, most importantly, how a young artist like him navigated the often closed doors of the art world. "I saw the intensity in your drawings," she said. "There's a rawness, but also a sense of hope and tenderness. That contrast is something my readers would connect with." Malik's heart soared. Finally, someone understood. In the days that followed, Sasha asked for a handful of sample images. She planned to feature him in an upcoming blog post about new voices in the city's art scene. Malik, never one to pass up an opportunity, spent hours carefully photographing his best pieces. He wrote thoughtful captions about the meaning behind each piece, the mediums he used, and the personal experiences that fueled his creative process. He was honest about how, for years, he'd faced racial prejudice, not only within certain art circles but also in daily life. He recounted how an upscale, supposedly diverse gallery had once asked him to deliver a package, mistaking him for a courier, dismissing the possibility that he could be the artist of the moment. When the City Canvas post finally went live, Malik was at first just thrilled to see his name in print, digital print, yes, but still real. The article showcased 4 of his paintings, each accompanied by a paragraph analyzing his use of color and symbolism. Sasha's writing was compelling. She described him as a rising talent with an unwavering social conscience. She praised the subtle commentary woven through his brushstrokes and lamented the gatekeepers who had failed to see his worth. Malik's phone buzzed with congratulations from friends, family, and even a few acquaintances he hadn't heard from in ages. But nothing prepared Malik for the wave of interest that surged overnight. Within 24 hours, the post had been shared across various platforms. Comments poured in, praising his work and expressing anger at how difficult it had been for him to find representation. A few smaller progressive galleries reached out directly, asking whether he had any upcoming shows or if he'd be interested in participating in group exhibitions. His social media following, once a modest circle of close friends, ballooned to thousands, then tens of thousands, as more people discovered his bold, emotional style. He was taken aback by one comment, in particular, from an esteemed curator named Helena Morris. She managed a respected community gallery known for championing marginalized voices. In her message, Helena wrote, "Malik, your art speaks volumes. I'd love to feature your pieces in our upcoming fundraiser for underserved youth. Let's connect." That moment of validation felt surreal. Malik had always believed his art could spark change or at least open a dialogue about race and identity. Yet seeing respected professionals, not just acknowledging but celebrating his work, was both exhilarating and terrifying. He realized he was stepping onto a bigger stage, where his voice and vision could have a lasting impact, and where any misstep would be amplified. Still reeling from the attention, Malik struggled to keep track of incoming requests. He spent his days responding to emails, direct messages, and phone calls. Eccentric collectors who specialized in emerging artists asked for quotes on his paintings. Journalists from local papers wanted interviews. A renowned interior designer inquired about commissioning custom pieces for a newly renovated downtown hotel. The swell of interest was as overwhelming as it was gratifying. For a young man who had nearly given up hope, it felt like plunging into deep waters with no life raft. In the midst of this whirlwind, Malik wrestled with anxiety. Up until then, all he'd needed to worry about was creating art true to his experiences. Suddenly, people were placing monetary value on his expressions, talking about 5-figure, even 6-figure sums for large canvases. Along with that came the pressure to produce more paintings, more interviews, more glimpses into his personal story. He caught himself second-guessing every brushstroke, wondering if it was marketable or if it lived up to the hype swirling around him. Late one evening, after a day filled with calls from potential buyers, Malik sank into his worn-out couch. He stared at the paintings stacked against the wall, works that had once been purely for himself. He worried that with this newfound fame, he might lose sight of why he started painting in the first place. The joy and catharsis of putting color to canvas had carried him through heartbreak, rejection, and systemic prejudice. Now, with the wave of attention lapping at his feet, he felt the creeping fear of losing authenticity amid market demand. Determined not to let external pressures corrupt his creative spirit, Malik turned to the very place he'd always found solace, his art. He started journaling about his feelings, his fears, his hopes, and his determination to remain genuine. Each night, he set aside an hour to paint just for himself, with no audience in mind, no collector waiting. It became a ritual, a quiet conversation he had with himself in color and form, a promise to keep his own voice at the forefront. Still, even as he clung to his personal integrity, Malik knew he needed to evolve strategically. If he was going to handle the influx of opportunities responsibly, he needed help. He remembered a distant cousin of his, Carter, who had studied business management and dabbled in the art world, albeit from the financial side. The two hadn't been in close contact, but family was family. Malik reached out, explaining the recent developments and expressing his concern about navigating commercial transactions. Carter responded with enthusiasm, happy to help his cousin. They arranged a lunch meeting in a cozy cafe not far from Malik's apartment. Over hot coffee and sandwiches, Malik poured out his worries. He needed someone who understood art valuation, contract negotiations, gallery percentages. Carter smiled, revealing that while he wasn't an expert in fine art, he did know about brand building and intellectual property rights from his corporate days. He could handle the behind-the-scenes negotiations, freeing Malik to focus on what he loved, painting. Encouraged by the idea of having an ally, Malik agreed to bring Carter on as his informal business manager. Their first order of business was to sort through the exhibition offers. Helena Morris's community gallery fundraiser was near the top of the list, but there were also intriguing invitations from newer, more progressive galleries outside the city. Carter suggested they concentrate on venues that aligned with Malik's vision and moral compass, places that truly cared about lifting diverse voices. Malik quickly agreed. It made no sense to chase short-term fame at galleries that might not value the message behind his art. Despite Carter's support, a gnawing feeling lingered in Malik. The memory of that humiliating day at the high-end gallery wouldn't fade. He found himself thinking back to the way the owner, Winston, had dismissed him with a sneer, making assumptions based on Malik's skin color and casual attire. A little voice in the back of his mind whispered, "Would Winston treat you the same now if he knew you were amassing fans and potential million-dollar valuations?" But whenever bitterness threatened to consume him, Malik returned to the quiet vow he had made, to stay true to himself. Revenge wasn't his style, at least not in the form of vitriol or stooping to Winston's level of prejudice. Instead, Malik allowed those memories to fuel his creative drive. He decided that if success ever brought him face to face with Winston again, he would rely on his newfound confidence rather than resentment. Amid all this internal turmoil, the world outside was echoing with recognition for his art. One of his larger pieces, titled Night Blooming Magnolias, was featured in City Canvas and soon became a viral sensation. The painting depicted a group of black women in white dresses standing under moonlit magnolia trees, a celebration of resilience and unity. The image circulated on social media with captions praising its beauty, and soon, art critics from mainstream publications took notice. Local TV reporters requested interviews. One morning, Malik found himself on a small local television segment, the host praising his meteoric rise. The phrase lingered in his mind, meteoric. It conveyed both rapid ascent and an implication that at some point, meteors must descend. He recognized the precariousness of hype, how quickly a rising star could be overshadowed by the next novelty. That knowledge made him even more determined to build something lasting, not just a fleeting brush with fame. Offers from collectors started to feel more urgent. People wanted night-blooming magnolias and were willing to pay extraordinary sums for it. Carter advised that they wait on deciding which buyer would get it, explaining that a well-placed piece in a reputable institution could enhance Malik's long-term reputation more than a quick sale. Malik, trusting Carter's business acumen, tentatively agreed. Meanwhile, the painting itself gained near-mythical status online. The more it wasn't for sale, the more people seemed to want it. With Carter's guidance, Malik also navigated a tricky commission offer from a major influencer who wanted a large-scale mural in her newly purchased penthouse. While she was undeniably famous, her brand leaned heavily on performative activism, showcasing social justice topics more as a trend than as an authentic commitment. Carter laid out the pros and cons, but ultimately, Malik decided to pass on that project. He didn't want his art to become a background prop in someone else's curated social media feed. This act of refusal bolstered Malik's integrity in the eyes of many who saw in him someone who wasn't swayed only by money. Balancing moral convictions with new financial realities was not easy. When asked to collaborate on philanthropic initiatives, like donating a portion of sales to local youth art programs, Malik wholeheartedly agreed. He saw these opportunities not as hollow gestures, but as ways to give back to the community that had inspired much of his work. He accepted Helena Morris's invitation to the community gallery fundraiser, where he donated a piece for auction. It sold for an impressive sum, half of which went directly to the gallery's youth outreach program. The success of that event further raised his profile, with media outlets highlighting his generosity and sense of purpose. Amid this growing popularity, Malik still struggled with the emotional weight of overnight success. Walking down the street, he occasionally noticed people pointing at him, whispering, or even approaching for a selfie. He felt gratitude but also mild discomfort. He wasn't a celebrity, just a painter trying to share a piece of his reality through color and shape. Invitations to exhibitions arrived steadily. Malik had to learn how to pace himself, to say no when needed and yes to the events that aligned with his creative vision. Carter helped manage the scheduling chaos, but the emotional toll was harder to manage. The fear of being a one-hit wonder gnawed at him. What if people moved on as quickly as they'd arrived? What if his next series of paintings didn't resonate the same way? In these uncertain moments, Malik found an unexpected support system among fellow emerging artists. Through social media and local art gatherings, he connected with painters, sculptors, and digital artists who had also struggled with underrepresentation. Some shared horror stories of their own encounters with snobbish gallerists and subtle racism. The sense of camaraderie was comforting. They exchanged tips on negotiating contracts, recommended curators who genuinely supported diversity, and discussed creative ways to fund art projects without compromising their values. One of these new allies was Nina, a conceptual artist whose mixed media installations explored themes of ancestry and migration. She introduced Malik to a network of Black artists who met weekly to collaborate on pop-up exhibitions in unconventional spaces, community centers, cafes, even open-air markets in underprivileged neighborhoods. Malik found these gatherings invigorating. Rather than bowing to the demands of a prejudiced art establishment, these artists were carving out their own platforms. The synergy among them fueled Malik's creativity. He worked with Nina on a joint piece that integrated painting with textile art. Their collaboration was later showcased in a small, progressive gallery that prided itself on inclusivity. While the event didn't attract huge sales, it garnered warm reviews from critics who appreciated the artist's unapologetic cultural expressions. It was the kind of authenticity Malik wished he could have shared with the world from the very beginning. At one of these pop-up gatherings, Malik met a soft-spoken but astute curator named David Park. David had a knack for bridging emerging talents with more established patrons who genuinely believed in diversifying the art world. Over a quick conversation near a table displaying handcrafted jewelry, David explained how he had observed Malik's rise and admired how he maintained a sense of authenticity despite the sudden fame. "I'd love to introduce you to some colleagues who are part of a newer art coalition," David offered. "We have members who organize gallery tours, run private showings, and lobby for minority representation in major city museums. If you're interested in forging longer-term change, these are people you might want on your side." Malik felt the weight of those words. Longer-term change. This was bigger than just one artist's success. The idea of joining forces with like-minded individuals to challenge the traditional art world's prejudices resonated deeply. He saw a future where young Black artists wouldn't need viral blog posts to be noticed, where their perspectives would be valued by default, rather than treated like a novelty. Over the following weeks, Malik and David conversed frequently, discussing opportunities for collaboration and speaking engagements. At first, Malik found it surreal to be invited as a panelist at university art programs and community events. People wanted to hear about his journey, his struggles, and his insights on how to dismantle the barriers he had encountered. While nervous, he seized these chances to advocate for other artists like him, sharing the stage with activists.